Hey guys, it's Dr. Hayes, and this video is about They Say, I Say chapters 4 and 5, because that was your assignment for this session of the class. So I combined them together because they sort of have similar topics. They have similar things to say, and I don't really need to go into a lot of detail about either chapter, so I've combined them together for this class. So I'm going to talk about some of my favorite and what I think are the most useful pieces of advice and templates from these chapters 4 and 5, and explain a little bit about the exercise at the end of chapter 5 that you were assigned to do. And then at the end of the video, as the syllabus says, I'm planning on just sort of setting up a little bit for you about your next assignment after your informative presentations. So that's kind of all the things we're going to be covering in this video. So the first chapter 4 is all about basically it's time to insert your voice, your I say, into the paper. So far we've talked a lot about identifying who they are and identifying what they say, and finding sources, incorporating them into our essays, having a clear they that we are interacting with, and having a good grasp and a good representation of what they say in the essay. But it's definitely time now to move over into the I say portion of the book and of the process. You're ready to respond to they. And so this first chapter 4, is all about ways that you can react to your they statements, your they sources and things. So basically they have boiled it down to 3 options: agree, disagree, or both, right? Both agree and disagree. This seems simplified. It seems like, really, that's it? That's all that we've got? Agree, disagree, or both? And so it seems a little deceptively reductive, but pretty much any statement that you would make to interact with a source or respond to a they that you have put in your paper can really be boiled down to one of these categories. And so the chapter, as they've been doing in the rest of the book, the authors of the book have provided some sample sentences, some templates, to where you can use these sample sentences depending on how you want to interact with your article or your source. And you can plug into the blanks the correct words from yourself and from your own opinion to make it, to have the appropriate reaction to your source. This is kind of intimidating for a lot of people. They don't feel like they really have anything to add to the conversation. They don't feel like they're worthy to say disagree with someone who's published a book or an article. That's kind of intimidating sometimes, but that's just one of those things you have to kind of get over and jump in and go for it, because your goal with these essays is to create a space for your voice in the conversation, and your familiarity and comfort in discussing the conversation is what's going to let the reader feel like you belong. So your clear establishment of they, and you're demonstrating that you understand everything that they are saying on different sides, will then make room for you to jump in and put in your I, and it will be expected and respected. So let's see. So the first one, disagreeing. Okay, so I've said this in class before, and I usually say it every semester, but you can get a lot more mileage in an essay. You can get a lot more words or a lot more content, however you want to put that, in an essay by disagreeing with a source you're using over agreeing with a source you're using. Actually, I think agreeing with a source is a little bit more difficult, so we'll talk about that next. But disagreeing is where you have found a source that They have written about the topic you're writing about. They have done studies about the topic you're writing about. However, they might not have hit the mark, or maybe their research is outdated, or maybe there is so they're not interpreting the data the way that you would have interpreted the data. So the main thing to remember about disagreeing is you need to give your reasons why. You can't just say, I think the example the book gives you is pretty good. You can't just add not to it and then move on. So if your source says, you can't just say, although they say women's rights are improving, I say women's rights are not improving, and then move on. This article says this, I disagree. Moving on. You can't do that. You have to give some reasons. You need a because in there. And then usually when you would explain the reasons why you disagree with a source you're using, you would use then other sources to back up what you're saying, as evidence as to why this main source you're disagreeing with is wrong. So that's a way that you would incorporate sources you agree with, and you would use them to back you up in challenging another source that you don't agree with. So you can kind of see maybe how a source that an author or an article or a book or whatever that you're bringing into the conversation of your essay, if you have something to challenge, there's a passage that you have found evidence to the contrary, or there's a thesis or a claim that they're making that you think doesn't make logical sense, and you explain that, you can probably get a lot more space in your paper, a lot more traction with your argument with using sources you disagree with. So your book on page 58 has a whole list. So if you're following along in your book, on page 58, there's a whole list of suggested ways that you can disagree and actually set it up with reasons rather than just, they're wrong. So just a couple. X author is X. X is mistaken because she overlooks blank. So maybe you found a hole in the argument. X's claim that blank, their thesis, rests upon the questionable assumption that blank. So maybe the question that the source started out with was faulty, and so they're making some sort of assumption at the beginning. A good example of this is in the last chapter we were looking at with the article by Dave Zinchenko, Don't Blame the Eater or something, and the exercise asked you to incorporate his to summarize that essay or that article into an essay you were writing at the end. And so if you recall, Dave Zinchenko's article starts with him establishing that childhood obesity is an epidemic, is a problem. And so you could incorporate Dave Zinchenko's article in your paper if you disagree, if you don't think obesity is the big health issue that some people think it is. And so that's an example where you disagree with the foundation of why he went forward with his study. And so you don't even think that foundation, that introductory question, that introductory idea is even sound. So that's what you're wanting to challenge. Point is, there's all different kinds of ways to disagree with either part or all of a source that you're using. And so the book there on page 58 has some sample sentences for how to interact with that. The next thing they talk about is agreeing. And so like I said, some people find it more difficult to include a source in their paper that they agree with because it's like, well, they're right. You don't really have anything else to say. And so it feels like you're just, this is what I think, and here's 5 people who also think that. The end. Thank you. Right? Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. And so it needs to be a little bit more than that. So if you're going to have sources in your essay that you are agreeing with it, that support your position, you want to add something to that conversation. You're agreeing, but there's maybe a difference, or there's something else that you're adding. so it's your book says bring something fresh, right? Bring something fresh to the conversation. So they have some examples here, and I thought these were pretty helpful, so I'm just going to read them. You may point out some unnoticed evidence or line of reasoning that supports X's claims that they hadn't even mentioned, right? So maybe you agree with their claim and you agree with their conclusion, but then you want to add, like, and they didn't even mention this over here that I've also discovered is true, right? So you have found evidence that goes with this, their claim, the source, that they didn't even mention. And so you're agreeing, but then adding on, right? That could be an option. You may cite some corroborating personal experience or a situation not mentioned by X that her views help readers understand. So you might find a source that makes a claim in sort of general terms, and you would say, this is proven in practice in my own experience because, and you include personal experience or observed evidence that supports the claim. Obviously, the author didn't discuss your personal experience when supporting their claim, so you can add that. Another way that you can include an article that you agree with, but then add to it, is maybe the article or the source. I keep saying article, but any kind of source, book or video or podcast or whatever. Maybe the original source that you're working with or including is a little complicated. Maybe it's a little bit, it's written in kind of a convoluted tone or vocabulary. Maybe it's the book uses the word esoteric, meaning it's a little challengingly worded and a little bit on a higher scholarly level than what you are comfortable with or what you think makes sense for your readers. And so you can include a source that you agree with their claims and their fundamental evidence, but you are serving as sort of interpreter of their information to the reader. So you're including a source you agree with and then adding your own contribution to the conversation by being there. In other words, like a normal person would say it. Here's what they're saying for normal people, right? So that's a way you can include a source and add to it if it's one you're agreeing with. But the important thing is that you sort of make yourself useful in the situation. A lot of scholars are sort of self-conscious about including too many sources in their paper that they completely agree with, because it begs the question, well then why is this essay needed? If people have already talked about this and they've already said everything that you're going to say and they've already agreed with you, and you found someone who's already done this study and has already made this claim and who's already had this idea, why does your essay need to exist, right? So that's something that I think new scholars are a little self-conscious of, is not having too many just straight up, yep, they're right, kind of sources in their paper, because it sort of hides their own contribution, hides their voice. Your book on page 60 has some templates here for, it's just sample sentences. If you want to include a source you agree with, then there's some ways that you can do that and it will help you. The third way is both. Agree and disagree simultaneously. The authors of your book love this one. And so, and I tend to like this too, because this is the, whereas agreeing is yes and, right? Both is yes but, right? So you agree with something that they've said, or maybe how they've said it, or you agree with some of the evidence they presented, but you're not willing to jump in, like, into the pool with, both feet, right? And so here on page 64, 64 and 65, they have lots of options here. They have lots of plans. So I'll read a couple of them. Although I agree with X up to a point, I cannot accept his overriding assumption that blank, right? So you're like, I'm with him up to this point, but then when he starts talking about this over here, I can't, he's lost me there. Although I disagree with much that X says, I do fully endorse his final conclusion that blah, blah, blah. Right? So, I don't necessarily agree with how he gets there, but where he ends up, I'm with him. I wouldn't have used the words he used or the evidence he used or whatever, but I do think he lands it. I don't think he ends in the right place. A couple more. While X is probably wrong when she claims that blank, she is right that blank, right? So you're saying, okay, so she's half right. There's the source I'm using, in your paper is this particular article. The claim that's being made is partly correct and partly not correct. And then again, remember your disagree because, and here are the reasons, right? And so you can use evidence from other sources to even show why this one you think is not fully correct. Let's see if there's maybe one more good one. My feelings on this issue are mixed. I do support X's position that blank, but I find Y's argument about blank and Z's research on blank to be equally persuasive. So this is a template that includes 3 sources, right? So you're saying, I know that I pretty much mostly agree with X, but then Y says these things that seem to contradict, but I am also kind of in agreement with that. And Z has provided some compelling evidence recently that might question what X and Y have done. So it's okay to sort of to end your essay a little bit undecided about some of the points, some of the evidence, right? You do not want to be undecided about your claim, about your specific thesis. You don't want to be undecided about that. But it is fine to be undecided about some of the finer points of the evidence that you're presenting. But yeah, so there's templates here on page 64 and 65 if you want to try to use those for your paper. So I keep saying there's sentences if you want to use them. If it were me and I were in this class and I was having to write essays, I would totally use these. I wish I had something like this when I was in school, to sort of be like, it's like a word bank for essay sentences, like generic, essay sentences. Because essays are pretty much all written the same way. They have the same wording. They have the same sort of puzzle pieces. And so I wish I had a resource that sort of combined them all together like this when I was in school. I'm not going to be going through your essays and trying to pick out and find where you use templates. I'm not going to require you to show me where you use templates. It's more for a resource for you, so you're not pulling your hair out trying to put your essays together. So I would definitely take advantage of them if I were y'all. Okay, the next chapter, chapter 5, is also focusing on the I say part. It's like, okay, we're moving on into incorporating our voice into the essay. So it's talking about, there's just a couple things I want to mention from this chapter. It's talking about sort of a nuanced skill, right? Like sort of a little bit of a skill where sometimes it's not easy for a reader, when they're reading an essay, it's not always obvious when the writer of the essay is presenting they're summarizing a perspective or a point of view of a group or a person in the culture, or just people in general or whatever. Sometimes it's not 100% clear when the writer of an essay is summarizing a position that they are saying, like the world or a source or a group, and then, or if they've moved on to what the writer is saying. And so sometimes the transition from I've established they, now I'm moving on to I, sometimes the transition there is not smooth. And so it's not 100% clear. And this goes back and forth in the essay. Maybe every paragraph has okay, this person says this and they say this. However, this is the case, right? And so this chapter gives you some tips about sort of getting that distinction a little bit more clear. So they use this term Let me erase this really quick. They use this term in chapter 5 called voice markers. Whew. I did not write that very neat. Voice markers. I swear that's what that says. So if you're like a visual person and you need to see it written out, that's what it is. Voice markers. And these are these sort of like transitional statements. You might have, it's not quite the same as just a transition sentence or a transition statement, but it is a transitional phrase or tone even in your paper that sort of clues in the reader that you are switching, and now you've got your point of view that you're going to be talking about. And so they give you some examples to follow, and it just takes practice though, to like signal when you are including your voice. But one of the main things, they have templates here on page 71 that are some ways that you can kind of indicate that I'm talking, this is me talking now, right? This is the writer of this essay. These are my views. This is what I'm saying. I was talking about they, but now it's me. So they have some templates here to help you kind of get the hang of that. On page 71 and 72, there are some templates there. But I wanted to talk about, they have this, and they have more on page 74. So there's like 3 different chunks of templates in this chapter for making sure that the reader knows that it's you who's talking instead of your sources. But one of the main ideas I wanted to talk about from this chapter is the use of the first person, I, right? And so you might have noticed that a lot of the templates in this book have first person pronoun in it. Adding to X's argument, I would point out that blank, right? My view, however, contrary to what X has argued, is that blank. So a lot of their suggested templates throughout the whole book have first person. I, my, me, the argument that, you're talking about their argument, but you're using first person. So I'm sure a lot of you in school have been told never to use the first person I in a paper, right? It's probably been hammered into you over and over and over when you're writing an essay not to use the first person I. And so you might have been questioning, maybe you didn't want to question because you're like, well, it's in the book and the professor's telling us to do it. But you might have been thinking it. And so probably some of you are watching the video like, yes, I was thinking it, but I didn't want to say anything. Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about this use of I. So I definitely think that there are good and bad places to use it. There are appropriate and inappropriate places where you would want to use the first person. So it used to be the convention where it was a complete no-no. It was not considered appropriate. It was too informal for an essay in school to use I. But you've probably noticed in some of the essays that you have been assigned, and you've probably noticed in the some of the articles you have found for your annotated bibs and for your research, that convention is not really as common anymore. You've probably noticed more and more and more, and I would say it's been getting more common over the last maybe 15 to 20 years, turn of the century. It's within the last couple of decades. It's getting more and more common for published scholarly articles to have the author a little bit more present. It used to be the idea that in a formal piece of research writing, the author's personality, the author's voice, the idea that this was even written by a human being should not be obvious, should not be evident at all. And so there should be no presence of the author in the essay. So that's why you were hammered into, to not using I. But lately, within the past couple of decades, I would say, it has been loosening up more and more and more. And so the authors of your text even say in here, there are some arguments that cannot be made without distinguishing, okay, this is what those people say. I, however, think differently, right? And this is why. And so a lot of their suggested templates for you to follow, a lot of their suggested ways to set up an argument include attaching your voice and your person to the argument. So I think that the reason why a lot of high school students and maybe college freshmen are told not to use I is because there are definitely good and bad places to use it, and it is a little bit more of a skilled instinct, right? That you would sort of instinctually recognize where it's appropriate and where it's not appropriate. So I was going to give you a few examples of where I think it is appropriate and where it's not. So the first place where you might want to use it, let me write on my board here, is the introduction. So we've talked about in class, there are multiple ways to start an essay. There's multiple things you might want to do. You might want to have a quotation that's cool. You might want to have an interesting fact or statistic, or you might want to ask a question. Well, one option to start an essay, and as your text has explained in earlier chapters, is you can tell a personal anecdote or set up a personal experience that you've had that introduces your topic. And so maybe in the introduction is a good place where you can sort of establish your personal connection to the topic that you've been researching. And it used to be the wisdom was, who cares what your personal experience with the topic is? What is the evidence? What is the research? That's not necessarily the case anymore. More and more academic research that you find has, the author will say, I was, grading papers one day and a thought occurred to me. I wonder if blah, 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 blah. So they'll give a little bit of a narrative. Now, it doesn't need to drag on and on and on. This isn't like a diary. This isn't your journal. But having, a couple sentences in the introduction that kind of sets up your connection to a topic is happening more and more and more and getting more and more acceptable. So in school, you would just need to verify with the professor that you have. Some professors are old school and that don't fly with them. Some professors, like me, are sort of aware that conventions like that are changing, that traditions are changing as far as first person goes. So a personal anecdote in the introduction might be a good place. Another place in the body of the paper is if you have personal evidence. So maybe you personally experienced a situation that relates to the topic you are discussing. Maybe you had an illness that is, a piece of support for your claim. Maybe you lost a family member in an accident. Maybe you have went on a diet. Maybe you had a bad experience at a store. Whatever it is. You might have personal evidence that supports a point you're making. Now, the danger there is you don't want all of your evidence to be, well, when I went here and this happened, blah, blah, blah. So your personal experience of an issue is not the end all be all of the support for a claim. But if it will add to or enhance the scholarly data and research you found, I don't see anything wrong with inserting like a personal experience or as someone an account of a story of a conversation you had or somebody . So in the body, personal evidence. Another place would be similar to the introduction. In the conclusion, you might have sort of an emotional let's get real, come to Jesus talk, in the conclusion, and where you're trying to the turn the chair around backwards and talk man to man kind of a thing moment in the conclusion, where you are having this emotional appeal when you're appealing to your audience and letting them know what you want them to do now that they've heard your evidence. That's sort of in a persuasive essay. Maybe rather than the introduction, the conclusion is where you reveal a sort of a personal connection you have to your topic. Again, none of these are required. They are just places in an essay where it would be appropriate to have a limited sort of personal account where you insert your humanity into the otherwise robotic paper, right? And I think as you're reading, the more and more you read, you'll see that that's happening. Where do you not want to use first person? These are the things you want to avoid. When teachers have told you, do not use I in a paper, what they are probably referring to is completely useless I statements. And this is usually what students use the I for. I think, I feel, I believe, right? That's usually the I's that are unnecessary need to come out. So the fact that you're writing the essay lets us know this is what you believe, this is what you feel. Your book is giving you other more effective ways to do those vocal markers to establish that you've moved on. You're not talking about what somebody else thinks, you're talking about what you think now. So I think, I feel, I believe are unnecessary. Instead of saying, I think she is wrong because, you say, she is wrong because, right? You don't need the I think. It's in your essay. So we know that it's what you think, we know. And so these statements are very prevalent in usually beginner level essays. And so a lot of teachers of beginner level classes will sort of beat these out of you to don't say I, and they just put a blanket restriction on the first person I altogether because they want you to get in the habit of being able to write an essay without it. So it's kind of like one of those, they have to break you down before they can build you up kind of a thing. So you have to get out of the habit before you can be cautious and discerning enough to use it in an appropriate, meaningful, useful way in your essay. So these are the things that are no-nos. They don't belong in an essay at all. And so that's kind of the position there. So I wanted to kind of address that first person. So your exercise, your assignment for this chapter is at the end. It's exercise 1. It starts, the instructions for it are on the bottom of page 74, and then it continues over on to 75. So what this is kind of be a little bit of a tricky reading response to do. But I think what the easiest way to do would be if you take a picture of it, if you have this capability. I think if you can get Canvas on your phone, this would be easy. But you take a picture of it, and what I did was, it's asking you to identify, it gives you, this is like a whole little essay here. This whole page is something that somebody wrote. It's an essay. And it's asking you to identify spots where the author refers to they, the views of others, and then the signal phrases, those vocal markers that she uses to distinguish her view as opposed to their view. And so what I did was I went through and I used a highlighter to highlight where she's incorporating the thoughts of someone else, a they, and then I used a pen to underline where it's her vocal markers, her signal phrases, that this is now her point of view, right? And so I went through and highlighted and underlined to sort of indicate which was which. And so if you want to do something similar, like most of us have a smartphone. If you don't have the capability to do this, you can just type out a description. In the first paragraph, a couple phrases she uses as signal phrases or this and that. So if you want to type it out and describe it, you most certainly can, if you're not real tech savvy. But I think if you wanted to, take a picture with your phone of the page, and then use the edit, and you can sort of underline and highlight, and maybe attach it. You can upload it to Canvas as the picture file, and then maybe in the comment you could say, red underline equals they, black underline equals I, right? In the essay, if you want, if you're still confused about how to maybe do that, or you need more suggestions, let me know. But I think that would be an easy way to do that activity. Or like I said, you can just describe the phrase and describe what she's doing in type out some of her phrases in more like paragraph form if you want to do that. So that's everything from these chapters. Just very briefly, we'll talk about this more later, but your next phase of your assignment, your next assignment after your informative essay and presentation is a field research project. So I wanted to go ahead and sort of just put this out there, put a bug in your ear about this one. You're going to be interviewing someone that has some sort of connection to your final topic, your persuasive topic, and your goal will be to get a quotation from them. Next week, I'm talking more. I think it's next week. We're talking more about different kinds of field research, like data, quantitative versus qualitative data, and what all goes into that. But I wanted to tell you ahead of time, you're going to be finding someone to interview. You're going to ask them at least 5 questions, and you're going to have the questions typed out. You're going to have their answers somehow, whether they said it and you wrote them down, or whether you sent them the questions and they wrote it out. But you'll have to submit, the questions and then their answers somehow. So be thinking about who you might want to get and what you might want to ask them. And then you're going to have to do the other half of the field research project is a survey where you're going to, this is coming up in a couple of weeks. I have video about this and we'll talk more, but you're going to make a survey online. It's anonymous, but and I have a whole video showing you how to do it, where you'll make a survey with quantitative, like measurable questions like yes or no, or a age range, or a numerical data, and you're getting there. And so the goal for that, getting people's feedback in that way, is you are attempting to collect your own statistic for your paper. So some of you might have encountered statistics in a source that you're citing, but the idea with this field research is instead of quoting someone that someone else interviewed, you're interviewing someone. Instead of quoting a statistic that someone else collected in a study, you're going to collect it, right? That's the next phase of research, is collecting your own data if the data doesn't exist already. And so we're just kind of doing it on a mini scale, just to get a taste and to practice it and kind of see what it's like. So that's what's going to be coming up as your next major assignment after you finish the informative and the formative paper and presentation. And that assignment, the results of your field research, will then feed into your final paper. I will expect in your final persuasive essay to see where you have cited and mentioned the person you interviewed, and where you have cited and mentioned the statistic that you gathered from your survey. And so that's the idea, is you're gathering evidence on your own to go into your final paper. So I know it's still a little ways off. It's a few weeks away, but because you're gonna have to think of someone to interview and arrange that with them, and you're gonna have to think of questions, I have to give you time to collect the responses. So I wanted to go ahead and just put that little bug in your ear that's coming up, and to notice it. And of course I'll be available if you have further questions, and the closer it gets, if you need help, I'll be available for that too. Just get in touch. But I think that's all I've got for today. So hopefully that all made sense. Hopefully it gave you a little bit more confidence about inserting your voice into your essay, and not just relying on quoting a bunch of stuff from other people, but you have something to say too, and you have some tools with which to do that. So hopefully you're a little more confident with that. Again, if you have questions, get in touch. If not, I will see you next week. Bye.